Welcome to Connie Martinson Talks Books. My guest today is truly the epitome of that word, African American. His father was from Kenya, and his mother was out of Kansas to Hawaii. My guest is Barack Obama. He has written a wonderful autobiography as well as a look at America called Dreams from My Father. But lest one think he only looks at America, he did return to Kenya and looked at the family, and even the dynamics of politics. The book is subtitled A Story of Race and Inheritance. It's published by Times Books, and we'll be back after a short pause.
This is my niece, Mary Devon. She's 11 years old. I asked her to help me warn people that smoking's bad for them. And she said she hates smoking so much she didn't even want to talk about it. So I said, fine, she could just sit here and not talk about it if she wanted to, but Mary Devon, honey, now that you're here with a chance to influence millions of people, isn't there anything you want to tell the cigarette smokers of America?
Don't.
That's my niece. She'll talk your ear off if you let her.
We're talking with Barack Obama, author of Dreams from My Father, A Story of Race and Inheritance, published by Times Books. Welcome, Barack.
Thank you very much.
And I did say African American, and the fact that your father, who also was Barack Obama, was from Kenya.
That's right. He was part of that first wave of young Africans who, right after independence in the early 60s, came to the West in search of education, hoping to master Western technology and bring it back to develop a modern Africa.
And meet your mother at the University of Hawaii.
I met my mother there. She was coming from the opposite direction.
An American Caucasian.
She was a white American coming from a series of small towns in Kansas and Oklahoma. I like to joke that my grandparents on my mother's side are stepping out of an American Gothic painting because they're so prototypical average Midwestern Americans.
But they were also, especially Gramps, your grandfather, a liberal. And so was Tutu.
Right.
They were exceptional people. In many ways, both your grandparents and your mother and father were part of that, the 60s and the dream.
Yeah, I really, and that's part of where I get the title from, Dreams from My Father. I think they were all part of a hopeful time. And I think when I say that my grandparents were prototypical, I think what they represented was the best in sort of average American life, sort of decent people. They were liberal, but not in any ideological way. They just wanted to do the right thing. And in the early 60s, that mood of hopefulness, an integrationist spirit, a notion that we could create a more just and equal nation where race issues would not matter and there was going to be harmony. I think my entire family got swept up into that. Unfortunately, the dreams began to fray both within my own family and within the country as a whole.
When you are growing up in Hawaii, I was surprised that color would play such a bigoted part, especially at school.
Right.
Hawaii, to me, has always been the epitome of a melting pot,
right.
And that was really disappointing.
Right. Well, you know, I should say I think Hawaii is a wonderful place, and I think it probably is as successful as any place in accommodating a multicultural environment and groups and races working together. But what happened when I was there as a young person, as a child, is that the African American community there was very small. It was much smaller than it is now, for example.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, a lot of the race confrontations that ended up affecting me had more to do with just pure ignorance on the part of many of the people that I met.
But I said to you there was a moment that I found devastating reading that, and that was the day your grandmother had evidently been hustled on the street.
Right.
And comes home and tells you, and you hear her talking with your grandfather.
Right.
And what he finally says, she didn't want to say it was a big black man.
Right.
And it was as if suddenly your balloon fizzled.
Well, I think that's right. That was a powerful moment for me because I think it represented the notion that even within families that love each other, and my grandparents, my grandmother was extraordinarily loving, even within families with the best intentions, race can intrude in ugly ways, and that we can't escape sort of the historical legacy that this country has created, but also ended up affecting my father back in Kenya. We have this difficulty in understanding the other. We live as strangers, black and white. And although I think within my family, and hopefully through the journey that I record in the book, a greater degree of understanding is arrived at, I still think it's a difficult struggle.
It had to be doubly difficult for you because you were moving between two families.
Well, my father had returned to Kenya after he and my mother separated. This is when I was only 2 years old. And essentially my father became sort of a mythic figure to me.
The icon.
An icon. And my mother, who is just a wonderful, generous woman, I tease her sometimes that she was a proponent of Afrocentric education before it became fashionable, because she really emphasized and built up a strong self-image for me of what it meant to be an African and an African American, that I should be proud of that heritage and that culture. But nevertheless, it was extraordinarily difficult to grow up in both Hawaii and then later in Indonesia, where I was often the only person of African extraction there, and I did not have male role models, much in the same way that many young inner-city kids these days don't have role models that they can look up to.
In some ways, the book is not unlike sort of Jason the Golden Fleece, a Greek tragedy, in the sense that your father comes back once when you're 10.
Right.
And it isn't until years later that you learn the real story of what happened to him back in Kenya.
Right.
Where he goes back, works for an oil company, he's king of the hill,
Right.
marries again, and then because he starts to speak up, and because of the changing political scheme,
Right.
he's from the wrong tribe.
Right. He ends up being blacklisted from the government, and in fact dies a very bitter and lonely man. There is a tragic element to that, and part of what I had to come to terms with in writing the book and in discovering that entire side of my life and my family was to really recognize that he had been shaped by many of the forces that I was struggling with as a youth. That he, as a African, although was not genetically mixed, so to speak, culturally was caught in this cross-pollinization, this hybridization, this movement from traditional African society into suddenly being catapulted to the modern age. And I think in the end he was not ever quite able to completely bridge that schism between modern life and traditional life. That probably is a schism that, for him at least, was just as powerful as any schism between black and white.
Yeah, because he really was going from almost the 1800s into an advanced 20th century when he goes to Harvard for an economics degree.
Right. I mean, the leap that my father made is just extraordinary. And if you look just 2 generations back, the leap that my grandfather made. My grandfather, I learn towards the end of the book, was the first person in his village to encounter white people. And we forget sometimes in American culture, because the black-white issue has been so long, because slavery started so long ago and the slaving trade began on the West Coast very early. In many parts of East Africa, there was very minimal contact between white and black until very late, so that my grandfather, who was born in 1895, is
It's like you went to the moon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, suddenly he now has to, he comes, I tell a story about him coming back from his encounters with white people and wearing Western clothes for the first time. and his father saying, to his brothers, "Don't touch this guy. Don't talk to him. He's unclean." And those kinds of conflicts, where by the end of his life, he's now suddenly looking and riding in airplanes and riding in motor cars, and right, the entire transformation that took place there, I think, was powerful and difficult, and I think ended up shaping both my father's life and, as a consequence, my own.
Talk about change, because we'll sort of jump over a little bit. You go to Occidental, you go to school, college in New York,
Right.
But you end up in Chicago through the influence of a man named Marty.
Well, I call him Marty. That's a pseudonym.
All right.
Right.
Who brings you back to Chicago to teach you how to be a community leader.
A community organizer.
And, well, I guess a leader organizer
Right.
in that world. And how you got MET, M-E-T, as the first sort of object for your group to say, wait a minute, here's where we attack first.
Right. Well, I ended up, this was in the early 80s, I became a community organizer, and I think I was running counter to a lot of my generation who, this was in the midst of the Reagan era, and most of my contemporaries and classmates were going in the opposite direction to Wall Street and thinking about making money. And I think the reason that I became a community organizer was in part to try to reestablish or connect with the dreams and the idealism that had brought my parents together. In my mind, my identity was wrapped up with sort of images of freedom riders in the South and kids marching for their freedom. And I wanted to be a part of that because my sense was that by being a community organizer, you could bring together the many disparate strands in America.
Barack, there's a point in here where the people aren't going to stick with you. And I wonder if you would read where you begin, let me ask you something, and
Sure.
down to here,
No,
because it's as pertinent today.
Okay.
Just set the scene,
Sure.
what's happening.
Well, the context here is I've just arrived as an organizer, and I'm discovering suddenly that the organization's about to fall apart. This is in a low-income neighborhood in Chicago. I'm working in public housing developments in Chicago. I'm very green behind the ears, and I'm a little shy, and I'm a little... I'm very inexperienced, and suddenly I find out that these leaders in this community, these low-income residents, really want to quit the organization. And I'm sort of in a panic, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly I should do. And so this is my sort of first burst of anger at them, which I think catches them by surprise. How far would you like me to go?
Just to the bottom of that paragraph.
Okay, good. And essentially, the conversation goes something like this. Let me ask you something, I said, pointing out the window. What do you suppose is going to happen to those boys out there? Barack, no, I'm just asking you a question. You said you're tired the same way most folks out here are tired. So I'm just trying to figure out what's going to happen to those boys. Who's going to make sure that they get a fair shot? The aldermen? The social workers? The gangs? I could hear my voice rising, but I didn't let up. You know, I didn't come here because I needed a job. I came here because Marty said there were some people who were serious about doing something to change their neighborhoods. I don't care what's happening in the past. I know that I am here now, and I'm committed to working with you. If there's a problem, then we'll fix it. If you don't think anything's happened after working with me for a year, then I'll be the first one to tell you to quit. But if you're planning to quit now, then what I want you to do is answer my question.
Thank you.
Sure.
Who's going to take care of those boys?
Who's going to take care of those boys? I mean, that scene takes place where there are a bunch of kids right outside the office where I'm talking to these people, and they're throwing stones. They're basically tearing down, the debilitating, demoralizing environment that's around them. They're pulling down windows and throwing stones at the doors, and suddenly, I get sort of an epiphany and see that nobody's tending to them. And I guess, in part, I identify with these young men because they don't have fathers either, and I'm thinking nobody's looking after them.
Barack, you just said something about the men of your generation who graduated, who went on to Wall Street.
Right.
Would they have, and we're going to take a short pause, and maybe we come back, we can answer that. Would they have had that opportunity without affirmative action? And if they have lost their dream and their only object has been money, how will they react as affirmative action is being killed? We'll be back after a short pause.
If anyone ever tells you that your thoughts aren't important, or that you're wasting your time, and if they tell you that you'll never make it, or that you dream too much, if anyone ever tells you you're too much anything, or not enough anything, well, what they think means nothing. A message from the U.S. Navy, where we believe the only way to grow is to rise to the challenge.
We're talking with Barack Obama, author of Dreams from My Father, A Story of Race and Inheritance, published by Times Books. Barack, before the break, I mentioned friends of your generation
Right.
who, Wall Street, and we should tell our friends in the audience that you did take time away from Chicago to go to Harvard Law School, where you became president of Harvard Law Review.
That's right.
I hate saying first black, but it's in the book. And whatever, you were a leader who was elected.
Right.
You didn't go into Wall Street. You've gone back to Chicago
Right.
and civic rights, civil
Right.
rights.
Right. You know, I'm currently a practicing civil rights lawyer, which means that I get involved in a whole range of different issues that touch on issues of race. You know, I do voting rights. I do employment discrimination law.
Well, NAACP Legal Defense Fund had really been one of the pioneers in that field.
Right. Well, in fact, and we do some work with LDF, certainly on voting rights, as well as some of our employment discrimination work. Well, you know, one thing that's interesting about the current debate surrounding affirmative action is how little attention is paid to the difficulties in prosecuting employment discrimination. If you listen to the debate, you would think that you walk into any major corporation, and there are all these black folks there doing great, and all these Latino folks are doing great, and Asian Americans are running everything. And the truth of the matter is...
And some of them are women.
Right. And,
Yeah.
and the truth is, if you walk into these offices, that's not the case, and it's extraordinarily hard to bring employment discrimination suits just because generally public interest firms are outmanned, outgunned in terms of the money and lawyers that can be devoted to these cases. And the judiciary these days is not very sympathetic to the cause of civil rights. And so as a consequence, part of the reason I think that I wrote the book and included those chapters you mentioned on community organizing is that progress is probably not going to come through the courts these days. We're not going to see a Brown versus Board of Education type of decision anytime soon. What we're going to have to do is to sort of work at the grassroots level and the community level, and also rediscover some sense of mutual responsibility between black and white America if we're going to make progress into the 21st century.
Isn't that wishful thinking? Because until economics are... liberalism seems to fly out the window when people are nervous about their economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think that is true. What I do think, though, is that there is the possibility of building common ground around an economic agenda that would be good for all people. And, you know, the problem we have, and this is why the race card can always be played, is that basically we live where blacks and whites are strangers to each other. We don't know each other's stories. We don't have a sense that we have so much in common. And you know, I tell an interesting story. Actually, it's not in the book, but when I got married, I invited Tutu, my grandmother, this little old white lady, out to the south side of Chicago to my mother-in-law's house. And so my grandmother walks in. It's all black people in the room, and she's, you know, the only white person there except for my mother. And she's feeling a little nervous and a little out of place, and she suddenly sees this table set with fried chicken and succotash and a Jello mold and all the things, and suddenly she realizes that she has a culture that she's sharing with all these people, just as her grandson is now going to be sharing a family with these folks, and there's a sense of recognition there, and I think that we can build a progressive politics.
Oh, there's a lovely scene at the wedding where she puts her arms around two of the children and said, well, these are my two new sons or daughters there.
Right. And that's exactly right. And so, when I see the progress that's made in my family in terms of understanding, in terms of a spirit of communion, then I think that the country can achieve that too. But I think you're right that at times of economic scarcity, generally the politicians in this country right now want to look for scapegoats, want to organize around race as opposed to around principle and around values. And I think that's a mistake, and I think that can be countered, but it's going to require the kinds of grassroots mobilization and the kinds of work at a local level that I think I talk about a lot in those chapters on Chicago.
Wonderful man there, Reverend Wright.
Right, and who is my pastor, and he is a wonderful man. And I think that's an example of he's a pastor of a large congregation in Chicago. And one of the interesting things that I discover in my journey to discover what my identity is and who my father is also discovering sort of my own faith, which is not necessarily a traditional faith. I don't come out of an institutionalized religious setting, but what becomes important to me as I work with churches in the south side of Chicago and low-income neighborhoods is to realize that all the stories and songs of the church, the hope that is embodied in the church, the sense of liberation that is embodied in the historically African American church, is really something that moves me deeply, and I think is probably the main pillar around which a lot of inner cities communities are going to be built. And Reverend Wright, my pastor, who I speak about in a chapter in the book, I think represents the best of what the black church has to offer.
Barak, I can't escape without asking about the trip to Kenya.
Right.
And meeting all of the relatives, all your half-brothers and sisters, and especially the wonderful sister, Alma. Alma,
right,
who comes to visit you from having been studying in Germany, and really is like you're taking you into the dark of explaining your father to you.
Well, that's right. She's a wonderful sister and a wonderful character. I hope in the book. I hope she comes across that way. She and I first make contact when she finally visits me in Chicago, and she basically tells me the real story of what happened to my father after he left us, and sort of punctures some of the myths that I've been carrying around about him. And I realized that he had a tough time and that he went through the same struggles as I did. And I think it was that meeting with her that then opens the door and allows me to return to Kenya and finally fully embrace that side of my family and to understand what
even your older
that country's
brother.
About. My older brother Roy, who we now call Abongo, he's reasserted his heritage, but both of them teach me about family and teach me what it means to be a part of the African family.
And even the African family, and we talk about America and economics.
Right.
They were too the sort of the problems over your father's inheritance.
Right.
It is interesting how when the dollar comes in, love can sometimes fly out.
Well, I think that's right. And one of the things that I learned by going back to Kenya and learning the story of my father and grandfather is that we can't look at Africa through rose-tinted glasses. I mean, I think that there's good and bad in Africa. There's good and bad in black folks, just like there's good and bad in white folks. And what that does then is it gives us a responsibility. We have to choose what inheritance we want. Is it an inheritance of money or is it an inheritance of values? And I guess I end up opting for the latter.
And I look forward to speaking with you many more times, Barack.
I had a wonderful time.
This is only the beginning. Will you autograph my
I will be
book?
happy to.
And if you would like a copy of our publication, Good Books, send me a stamped, self-addressed envelope to Good Books, P.O. Box 69, 1640, Los Angeles, California 90069. Look for our column in California Press Bureau newspapers and support your local library. It is still our finest institution in America, and there's a place for everyone in the public library, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Barack.
I had a wonderful time.
Thank you.
Thank you.